Hello everyone, my name is Jessica Tobin with Elementary Nest, and I am back for another webinar series video. What we're going to be talking about today is planning for your ELA time. And your ELA time is your reading, writing, language block. So we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next hour. This webinar was a webinar that I did live several times for a couple of years, but I wanted to convert it into a YouTube video so that you guys could watch it whenever was convenient for you, and you could rewatch it as many times as you need. Just a couple things to know before we get started. There is a free downloadable workbook in the description below. I'll also post the little bit.ly link maybe right here. And that will be a free workbook for you to print. You can take notes. They're very basic, plain pages, so if you don't want to print it out, that's fine. Just go ahead and grab pencil and paper and take some notes. This is a longer webinar than the webinar we just did, which was for the end of the year. This one will probably be about an hour long. We'll see how long it takes me to record. And there is a very special 30-page freebie that I'll link to at the very end of the webinar, and it kind of just takes everything we talk about in the next hour and it puts it into action for you. So make sure you stick around for that. I'll drop a link for it at the end. I know I completely just cut myself off at the last video, but that's okay. We're going to dive in. We're going to get started. The title of our webinar today is 6 Things to Keep in Mind When You're Planning Your ELA Time. And like I said in the last little introduction, ELA is all things reading, writing, and grammar and language. So we're going to talk about taking the allotted time that you have for those topics, and we're going to figure out how to perfect them in your classroom. So let's look at the purpose for today. I would love for you guys to walk away today with some new ideas, some tips and inspiration. I want to find a way for you guys to decrease the stress that you have when teaching ELA, and I want you to perfect your block. I want you to have all of that time in your block really utilized well, and we're also going to cover Common Core state standards. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to talk about standards. Your school may have different standards than Common Core. If that's the case, just anytime I talk about Common Core state standards, go ahead and replace that in your brain with whatever your state standards are. I know Texas has TEKS, and I think Virginia has some, and Georgia. So if you are not a Common Core state standards school, that does not mean that you're not going to benefit from this webinar. It will just mean that whenever I talk about Common Core, you'll just replace whatever standards you have into that. So I want to bring to your attention the little yellow star in the top left corner of this slide. So on a slide throughout the webinar, if you see that yellow star, that means there's going to be a link in the description below for something you can download or something you can grab. So the yellow star in this slide represents the link below that you need to download for the workbook. Now the workbook, as you see, is a very simple note-taking sheet. It's not super elaborate. So if you don't want to print all that out, it's fine. You can just take notes as we go. Also, there is a 30-page freebie that you can get at the very end of this webinar. So if you stick around, I'll drop a link at the very end of the video for you to download 30 pages. It kind of takes what we talk about in the next hour, and it wraps it up for you nicely so you can go ahead and get started printing it all out and getting everything planned for your ELA block. So what you're going to learn today, there's 6 big things. So the title of the webinar was 6 Things to Keep in Mind When Planning for Your ELA Time. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what goes into an ELA block. So all the things you need in that ELA time. We're going to talk about the different structures you can choose. We're going to also talk about planning out what it's going to look like. So we're going to really talk about thinking about very specific things you need in your ELA block that you might not think that you need. We're going to talk about plans for differentiation, so how to reach all of your students' reading levels and writing levels. We're going to have some organizational tips time. And finally, we're going to talk about the next steps to getting started. So we're going to begin learning about step 1, and these are kind of the essential questions you're going to ask yourself when just completely stepping back and looking at your ELA block, the very simple things of what's going to go into it, when you're going to teach it, where your kids are going to be, the very basics of your ELA block. So I have a picture on the screen of the page in your workbook that you're going to be working on right now for step 1. As you can see, it's just your big ideas and your takeaways from these questions and this little section of our webinar. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is what subjects you're going to cover during your ELA block. Some of you guys may have different subjects to cover. If you have state-specific standards, if you don't have any standards at all that you're going to be teaching, then go ahead and outline which subjects you're going to want to teach. Now, for Common Core, you have 6 Common Core ELA domains. Now, that's going to cover literature text, informational text, writing, which covers narratives, opinion writing, informative writing, and then revising, publishing, and editing. It also covers research writing as well. You're going to have your language, your foundational skills, which are your phonics, your phonemic awareness, the fluency aspect, and then finally you've got your speaking and listening. So these are the 6 parts of ELA that Common Core has outlined. However, it may be different for your set of state standards, depending on if you guys are not Common Core. But these are the big, broad ideas you're going to be teaching within your ELA block. Question 2, how much time do you have in your day to squeeze in ELA? So you're going to have to look at your schedule of your entire school day between specials and lunch and technology time. You're going to see when you can plan out to have a huge ELA block. Some of you guys may have a solid 2 hours. Some of you may have an hour in the morning and then an hour when you come back from lunch. It just depends on your specific schedule. So make sure you find out how much time you have to teach all of your domains within ELA and when you'll be teaching that during the day. Question 3, and the final question for this section, is where are your students going to be during your ELA block and what are they going to be doing? Are you going to let them do flexible seating? Are you going to have them working in groups that are tiered? Are they going to be all in their seats? So this is definitely something that you need to think about before you start planning. Now we're going to talk about structures in the next step, so that may help answer this question. But that just needs to be one of the main things you're thinking about before we go into planning for your ELA block. The next couple slides, we're going to be covering step 2, which is all about the different structures that you can choose in your ELA block. But I wanted to pop on here really quickly because I did not put the yellow star on the slide screens like I said I was going to, because the next few slides, it's not essential that you get the links in the description, but I wanted to offer them in case you wanted them. So I will be dropping links in the description on each of the next couple slides for books. Amazon links to books if you wanted to study the structures more. So maybe when you're watching this, push pause on the structure that you are interested in learning more about and click my Amazon link. It is an affiliate link. If you want to study a little bit more on that specific topic, I will link a couple books that I think will benefit you for each of the different structures. And step 2, so different structures for ELA. On the slide, you see the image of the workbook page we're going to be working on for step 2 structure options. Jot down some big ideas and some takeaways. We're going to talk about 4 or 5 different structures you can choose from. There are definitely more than what I'm going to cover, but I'm just going to try to take some of the bigger ones, some of the more popular ones that people use, and cover those. So first is the Basal reading approach. Now, a Basal text is the kind of textbook kits that your district may offer you. It's a very traditional structure that's been around for quite some time. A few popular examples for ELA are Reading Street, Journeys, and Wonders. Now, some schools may require this of you, and they have their own structures typically within the Basal reading that they suggest. It just depends on which Basal you have. But if you have a Basal and your district is not as strict as others, you might be able to take the curriculum materials that you have from the Basal and spin them into a different structure that we're going to talk about in the next slides. But some Basals and some districts are more strict where you have to follow exactly the way that they do that. So that's definitely something you need to look into before you start planning your ELA block. A popular option for elementary students is literacy workstations or literacy centers. So that's going to be the rotation of students in small groups. They're working independently on different activities. And that gives the teacher a chance to work in her small group while the other students around the classroom are still on task with an assignment for the day. Now, an example of what this might look like in your classroom would be 5 different groups of students working in different areas of the classroom on maybe 5 different skills, such as word work or language time or writing or technology. Having that small group with a teacher time, or simply just having some independent reading time. Now, accountability is a huge part of this structure option because as the teacher, you're going to be with the small group at that time. So the rest of your students are going to be trusted to be responsible for their own learning, for their own behavior. Now, of course, at the beginning of the year, you're going to be working a lot with behavior and structure. But hopefully at a certain point you will be able to work at your small group table without a lot of interruption. Now, a good resource, the link is in the description below, like I talked about. A good resource to read if you're interested in literacy workstations. I love Debbie Diller's Literacy Workstations text that kind of introduces you to literacy work centers and literacy workstations. And there will be a link in the description below for her book if you're interested in that. Another option is Daily 5 or Cafe. So Daily 5 is another structure option. It was created by 2 women. They call themselves the Two Sisters. These are very structured literacy centers. They're kind of similar to the literacy workstations that we were just talking about, but they're a little bit more structured. So in Daily 5, you work in 5 groups. You have read to self, work on writing, read to someone, listen to reading, and word work. Cafe is also a part of the Daily 5 framework, and Cafe stands for comprehension, accuracy, fluency, and expanding vocabulary. Now, all skills covered in Daily 5 and Cafe are balanced for your reading block, and they will give you an opportunity to eventually cover everything that's required of you by the end of the year. So small group can happen with this structure during conferences or during one-on-one time, and even during small group. A good resource is in the description below. It's the book that the Two Sisters wrote for Daily 5 and Cafe. So if you scroll down and you're interested in that, click pause on the video, scroll down and grab that book if you are interested. The workshop model, so reading workshop and writing workshop, is a structure that's been around for quite a while. While many workshop models can really look different in each classroom, the core parts of them are pretty similar. So the core parts of the workshop model are the mini lesson, you've got independent practice time, and then you've got your closing. So you meet back on the carpet and you have your closing time. It's a very predictable structure where the teacher introduces the target for the day, they give their instruction on that target. So if you're teaching inferences or main topic, you're going to have that lesson or that direct instruction on inferencing and main topic. And then the teacher's going to model how to do that skill when they're reading. And then, so there's the modeling, and then you're going to break out in groups. Guided reading groups can happen during this time as well. Writer's workshop follows a similar structure. Both Reader's Workshop and Writer's Workshop models have that closing part of the structure where they reconvene at the end to discuss what they've learned. Now, if you're interested in the Reader's Workshop and the Writer's Workshop models, push pause on the video, scroll down, and grab those 2 Amazon links to those books for you if you want to learn more about that. And finally, the last one we're going to talk about is how to kind of take structures that already exist and spin them to work the way that you need in your classroom. So let me explain this little scenario. So what I did in my 2nd grade classroom is I took pieces of Daily 5 and then I kind of tweaked a couple of the groups so that it fit my classroom and my schedule a little bit better. So what I did during my Daily 5 is I mixed it with literacy workstations from Debbie Diller. So I kind of mixed those 2 together to make it work for myself. So I turned it into 5 groups of skill drill, which the skill drill time was the time that I hit reading foundational skills, phonemic awareness, their phonics, their language, their grammar. So skill drill was definitely that very hands-on time where they're learning and practicing those language and grammar skills. I also had teacher time. So teacher time was when they came to me at the small group table and we had direct differentiation for each group of students. I also had technology, and whatever they did at technology did change every day. So they had a mixture of, doing some language and grammar practice skills. They had some reading. They could do AR test. It just depended on the day what they did during technology. I also had read to self, which is a Daily 5 standard, or not standard, but a Daily 5 structure component, and work on writing, which is also a Daily 5 structure component. So I kept those 2, and then I changed 3. So I kind of meshed them, which is definitely something that you can do as well. So that's just a suggestion. So this is your classroom. These are your kids. You're going to do what's best for them. Maybe try a structure that has been outlined for you, and then as the year goes on, tweak it to see what works for you. Now, there are 2 sheets in the 30-page download that you're going to get at the end. So this little arrow up here, you see the little download button up here, that is a picture. So if you see that little emblem in the top corner, that means that this is part of that 30-page download that you'll get at the end. So I'm going to put a link for that in the end. But these 2 pages are included in that 30-page download, and it is going to give you an opportunity to kind of plug in some mock schedules of what's going to work for your class. And then here's a look at everything else that you're going to get for planning for your structures. So you're going to take notes on different structures and see which ones really are going to work in your classroom. And this also has the little emblem, which means it is part of that big email list download that you can get if you sign up. Step 3 in our workbook says planning it out at the top, because what we're going to do in the next probably 10-ish slides, we're going to talk about some of these smaller pieces that go into the ELA block, such as your learning targets, your mini lessons, your differentiation, and read alouds and whatnot. So we're going to talk about the small pieces that are going to go into it so that you can kind of get an idea of everything that you'll need in the next few slides. Jot it down on your paper, take some notes so that you can kind of start plugging in what's going to work in your class. So, learning targets are what we're going to start with at the very beginning, because I think it's very important to start every single lesson and every single subject that you're teaching that day to start with a learning target or a daily objective. And most districts are pushing for targets to always be covered and recovered at the end of the lessons as well. It's just kind of to introduce them to what they're going to be learning that day so that all of their learning within that time is very intentional on that standard. So it's probably a 1 to 2 minute discussion piece to kick off your reading block for that day. You can have a learning target for all of ELA, or you can have a learning target for reading. You can have a learning target for writing and grammar. So you can have multiple, or you can have one, just depending on what you're teaching the students that day. Another piece of your ELA block that you need to ensure you have every single day is your daily mini lesson for each topic. So this is going to be your whole group instruction time, and then breaking out into maybe partners to practice that skill before you break out into groups. So you'll have your daily mini lesson, you'll have like a practice opportunity based off of that whole group, and then you can break out into small groups to teach all your different subjects or all your different skills. But your daily mini lesson is going to be your whole group activity where you're introducing any new material. So if you're teaching a new reading standard that day, that's going to be your time that you're going to have your read aloud or some sort of mentor text. Partner discussion is very important. Maybe this is your opportunity for them to teach each other. It just depends on what skill you're teaching that day, but the daily mini lesson is definitely important. Part of your mini lesson is an anchor chart opportunity. So what the picture you see here is an interactive anchor chart for a 4th grade skill. That's I believe summarizing, which is the second skill in 4th grade. So giving the students an opportunity to interact with an anchor chart after reading a text. So the little post-it notes they'll write about the SWBST part of the story you just read. So here's another example for taking your anchor charts within your mini lessons and making them work. So in my ELA units. So I have ELA units for every standard in every domain for kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. So in each of those, I have a little mini poster. And if you want to turn those mini posters into bigger anchor charts, you can for sure. So it just gives an opportunity to take those mini posters, and as you're discussing the mini poster, you are teaching the students these direct skills. So this is recounting is the 2nd grade skill. It's getting the students ready for summarizing, actually. So they're going to cover your characters and your setting, your events, the problem solution, and this is just your opportunity to teach those students the exact skills that you're wanting for each specific standard. So this is during your mini lesson as well. So here's an example mini lesson. This comes from the Author's Purpose unit. I believe it's my 2nd grade unit for Author's Purpose. And Common Core teaches Author's Purpose a little bit different than what we're used to. We're used to PIE. They changed it to ADE. But, so this is just an example. What you're going to have is you're going to start with your mini lesson, or it's not your mini lesson, your mini poster or your anchor chart. And you're going to introduce this skill. Then you're going to model the skill with a read aloud or a mentor text. And you're going to give the students an opportunity to see how this skill can take place within a read aloud or a text that the teacher reads. And then there are some partner activities, some small group activities to practice before you split up into your small group for the day. So that's just one example of how to work mini lessons into your day. So we've talked so far about learning targets and mini lessons. And then you're going to make sure that you have strong read alouds every single day for each of the skills. Now, I have a star on this screen because I'm linking in the description below two blog posts. The 2 blog posts I'm linking are suggested mentor text for each of the domains for reading informational and reading literature. And it's focused on pretty much like grades 1, 2, and 3. So I have 2 blog posts for that if you're interested in looking at suggested mentor text and suggested read alouds for those standards. But read alouds are very important to follow up your mini lesson so that the students can really see that standard in action. So it's very important to have that, and it's also very important to have a lot of these books that are standard specific in their read to someone or their read to self activities so that they can see firsthand and practice that skill by themselves. Another thing that you're going to need to have every single day, besides your learning targets and your mini lessons, is your opportunity for the students to really get their hands on practicing that specific skill. So what they're going to do is you're going to make sure at least one or two of your groups that you guys split up into cover the standard that you taught that day. So if you're teaching, in the pictures you see here, they're working on new vocabulary words. So if you're teaching that standard, which is the fourth standard in RL and RI domains, you're going to make sure that at least two of their small group breakout groups cover practicing that new skill. So maybe find a technology activity that covers it, or I have a couple of printouts in my ELA units that you can print out, put in a folder, and have books on hand where they can really practice those skills by themselves or even with their groups. You're also going to need to plan out during this time how you're going to differentiate your instruction. And I will have a completely separate group step for this. So we're going to dive into differentiation a little bit deeper in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to make sure that you have in your brain this is something that you definitely need to take into account when you are thinking big picture of your ELA block. So we've talked learning targets, anchor charts, mini lessons, read alouds, making sure they have their hands-on engagement, and then your instructional differentiation. Now, the next few slides, I'm going to talk about three of the domains that aren't really thought about when you are really thinking about your ELA block. A lot of teachers just focus on their reading standards, but you need to make sure that you're always including all of your domains within your ELA block as well. A couple of those things, language and grammar and your foundational skills. Like I was saying earlier, foundational skills are the phonemic awareness, phonological awareness activities. It's also the time where you're going to practice fluency and reading expression. But make sure that you have an opportunity in your ELA block time to work in language, grammar, and reading foundation skills. So this is one of the reasons why, and I talked about it a couple slides ago, why I kind of tweaked the daily 5 structure to fit more of how it worked in my classroom, because I wanted to be able to work Common Core a little bit more specifically into my daily 5 and my literacy workstations time. So, and just like I said with reading lessons, you always want to have a mini lesson on any new material. So if you're teaching a language skill that week, you need to make sure that the students have an explicit instructional time on that learning skill. So in the picture you see, I think this comes from my verbs unit for first grade. Make sure you're teaching the students about verbs before you just throw some materials into their group time. So that's definitely important to always have mini lessons. So you may have multiple mini lessons within your ELA block time. It just depends on all the things that you're covering that day. Another thing that's kind of skipped sometimes, this is definitely the most skipped domain, because a lot of teachers teach speaking and listening just every single day without an explicit instruction time. So if you can cover your speaking and listening standards without teaching them specifically mini lessons and activities, that's perfect. But there's also a time for you to work in mini lessons and activities. You can put them into their small group time, different partner group and whole group games that they can play that really help practice those speaking and listening skills. And finally, you've got your writing. Now, writing is sometimes taught outside of a reading block, but if you wanted, writing can be included in your ELA block. It would just have its own group time. So what I did is during my 5 rotations, writing was its own time. So, and I always had a mini lesson that day for whatever we were teaching. So in the picture, you see all the materials for one lesson of narrative writing. So you're going to teach what narrative writing is, and you're going to give mentor text for the students before you break out into groups. And then some of the activities that you have for your narratives that are offered in my mini lessons, you can put into their groups if you'd like, or that can be the partner activities that they do before splitting up into groups. It just depends on what works best for your class, and that's why I'm going to offer you guys lots and lots of papers to really kind of hash everything out and plan everything, see what works best in your classroom. And then there's two things, informal assessments and formal assessments, that those are the two things that you definitely need to wrap up each of your days with. So informal assessments are going to happen much more often than formal assessments. Now, informal assessments can be anything from, anecdotal notes or, simple like fluency tests or activities. Another thing that you can do with informal assessments is to just take what the students did in their groups and use those to see how they're doing. So in the picture, you see a passage for like poetry unit. So maybe that would be what they're doing during their read to self time. And that could be an informal assessment to see how they're doing on that standard. Or on the right, you see a read aloud, or it could be an independent read, depending on where your students are at on their reading levels. And then in all of my ELA units, I offer graphic organizers that can go with any text. So you'll grab one of those graphic organizers for them to focus on that skill when they're doing their read to self or their read to someone or even their small group time. And then you've got your formal assessments. So these are going to be your summative assessments that you're going to teach at the end of a unit. So if at the beginning of this webinar, I started talking about author's purpose and author's point. I showed that mini lesson. So at the end of that unit, it might take 1 week to teach all of the mini lessons. It may take 2 weeks. However long it takes you to get through all of your standards for that unit, at the end of that, you're going to give a formal assessment. And I have formal assessments for all of the reading informational text and reading literature text units. So those are offered. If you're interested in those, it's just, they're all 3 pages. They have 2 passages and a couple questions about that specific skill. So formal assessments don't have to happen every single day. They just need to happen at the end of each unit, maybe every couple weeks, to see how your students are doing. During step 3, I talked about how we were going to discuss differentiation a little later, and now it is time to talk about our differentiation. So step 4 is planning to differentiate in your classroom. So grab your differentiation workbook page, and we're going to go ahead and get started talking about differentiating your instruction. There's a lot that goes into this, and it's going to look different in everybody's classroom, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of ideas that I think would work great for you. So first, we're going to talk about how to group your students. Now, you can choose to group your students heterogeneously or homogeneously. That simply means grouping them by level, like reading skill, or maybe if they took an assessment, students that have scored, X on an assessment versus a group of students that performed Y on an assessment, and then you can differentiate the lessons to fit for that. You could also just group heterogeneously, which is, groups that are completely random. You might have different learning skills all in that group, or, it could change every day. It could be the same. So it just depends on how you want to group your students. I always chose to group them by level so that I could, during my teacher time, I could differentiate all of the lessons in my teacher time activity without having to pull students from their groups. So I wasn't, sometimes if you're doing guided reading or conferencing, you're having to pull students from separate groups to teach a differentiated skill. But what I did instead is I just went ahead and grouped by skill or by level so that students, when they came to me, were automatically in their group of similar learning levels. And I did flex this a lot. And if you're going to group that way, you need to make sure to reassess constantly to make sure if you have students who are needing to move up or students who might need a little bit more help to be able to move groups. They're not permanent groups for the entire year. Make sure you do have that flexibility. So what we're going to talk about small group and guided reading. It's one of the most critical times in your ELA block because you're teaching to students at their learning level. This is a great time for any form of anecdotal notes or informal assessments to happen as well. Keeping up with all this paperwork can be really difficult. We'll talk about how to organize all that paperwork in just a bit. So 2 of my centers were always differentiated, and they had different documentation on each. So I will talk about that here. And if you see there's a little emblem in the top corner, it doesn't exactly look like this because I've updated it. This is a picture from like 2013. But so it's a little bit different looking. The fonts are a little different, but it basically has the same structure where you're taking notes and keeping track of what you're teaching in each group on each day. So if you look at the picture, I took notes for what my teacher time blue group did and what my orange group, what they did in teacher time Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then what my green group did. So it's helping me keep up with what I'm doing in each of the different groups because I know it can get extremely overwhelming if you're trying to differentiate material for every single group. Now, you don't have to use different material for each group if you don't want to. You can simply change how you teach a material for the students. So you can have it a little bit more scaffolded, or you can give a little bit more of an enrichment activity based on that material. So you can choose to have different material for all your groups, or you can have the same material. Now, I do think it's important when you're teaching small group that students are getting text on their reading level. So that will be the material that should differ with each group. So you might have some students who are reading level B books and some students who are reading level K books if you're doing guided reading. So it is important to get texts in their hands that are for their reading level, and also to have books in like read to self, read to someone activities where they're not leveled books, but just, high interest books. Also, we're going to discuss how to take documentation on assessment. Now, it's very important to document all assessment from day one because if you're dealing with students who might need gifted and talented applications, or if you're trying to get a student a little bit more time with intervention, assessment documentation is very important. So you might need to document their fluency scores, or even taking scores for each unit assessment as well. So that is definitely something that you need to keep up with, having baseline assessments for your students. Using these baseline assessments can also help you group your students. So if the computer picture you see in this represents the STAR or the MAP test that students sometimes take. So your school might be a STAR school, your school might be a MAP school. There are others they can use, but these are just popular options for standardized online testing. They do it 3 or 4 times a year. So some teachers may use that to group their students. They may say, okay, these students scored this on the MAP test, they go into this group, and then have 5 groups split up by that. Some teachers may choose to give a pre-assessment for each unit and separate students based on that. It just depends on what works best for your class and what you're wanting to do in each of your small groups. Now, I wanted to take a step back really quickly to talk about the importance of starting documentation on week 1. Just a little anecdotal note for you guys. I had a student who came in to my kindergarten classroom at the very beginning of the year, and I knew immediately that he was going to need some intervention. It was hard for him to even recognize what his own name was, like writing his name, and even sometimes answering simple questions like that. So what I did was I went ahead and I started documenting on day 1 for this student. And sorry, no, this was when I taught 2nd grade, not kindergarten. But so I started on day 1 for this student named Zach. And I made sure that I took a weekly assessment of everything I needed, because when your students are wanting to qualify for intervention or maybe some special education services, the amount of documentation that you need before they can be considered is huge in most school districts in most states. So if you know a student's going to need some extra help, it's definitely important to get as much assessments as you can as early as you can. And it also helps your teaching instruction. So getting an opportunity to look at your student scores as often as you can will help you regroup and make sure your student is in the best group that they can be, and making sure you're not keeping them back from anything they need to learn, or if you're over their head too much. Now, differentiation, small group is not simply for struggling students. There's also advanced students that need some differentiation too. During small group time, struggling students, they will need remediation and they'll need repetition. So as an example of remediation is shown in the picture, the students are getting the same text as the entire class. However, the struggling group of students in your small group, they might need help breaking this passage up and getting a little bit more in depth with it, maybe a little bit more teacher guidance on that. So this example isn't shown, but my orange group of students in my 1st grade class may be struggling with decoding 2-syllable words. So during small group, we would have a quick little mini lesson teaching that skill, and then they would get a practice activity and reading text at their level to help practice that specific skill. Now, small group is not only, or differentiation is not only for hitting those students who are struggling, it is also an opportunity to help enrich those students who need a little bit more in-depth instruction. So you're really, your high-level students, that's your opportunity to nurture and really help advance those skill levels and those reading levels. So they don't just need more things given to them, they need more in-depth things given to them. So maybe giving them a harder text level to start comprehending and understanding. What you see in the picture was my highest group of 2nd graders. They were ready for chapter books in like January or February. So we started in small group really diving into chapter books. So they're still doing the interactive notebook activity that the entire class did. They just had a more in-depth and more challenging text that some of the other groups did. And then keeping up with all of the different things that you're teaching, like I said a couple slides ago, can get overwhelming. This is another page that's in that email list download that I'm going to link to at the end of the webinar. So keeping up with small group is difficult. This is just another graphic organizer to help you write down what you're going to do in each of the groups during your teacher time. So teacher time is that time in your small group where you have that group of students with you. There's going to be 4 or 5 kids at your table, and this is just a little sheet to help organize what you're going to do in each of your groups. So that will help document what you're doing as well in case you need to refer a student for intervention or even for gifted and talented. You can show the last 10 to 12 weeks of what you've done with those students to help. So we have 2 sections left, and those last 2 steps are more action-based. So they talk about planning out your next few steps and the organizational tips. So there's several opportunities for you to pause and grab links. There are several pages that have little stars on them. Make sure when you see the star, you go down, you get the link. Also, if you see the little downloadable emblem, that means that that page is included in that 30-page download, which is coming at the end of the webinar. So we're almost done with the webinar. We have 2 more steps to talk about, and then I will be dropping those links for you that you need. Step 5 is all about organization. So grab your Step 5 page and we're going to take some big notes. We're going to talk about how to organize your materials, your resources, stuff for the kids, stuff for the teacher, your lesson plans, anything you need, we're going to try to cover in the organizational tab. So you're going to start at the very beginning before the school year begins, or even at the beginning of the school year. You're going to find your standards for whichever state that you teach in. If you're a Common Core state, you're going to go to the Common Core website and go ahead and print all the standards that you need for every single domain. So if you're teaching Common Core, it's the 6 domains. If you are not Common Core, you're going to find your standards for your specific state and get them all printed. You want everything printed at the very beginning of the year so that you can be intentional about gathering resources and gathering materials and books that cover those specific domains. Now, you're also going to be collecting materials throughout the year. You can get a whole bunch at the beginning of a year or at the beginning of your year, or you can go as you teach. Now, there's 2 different ways that I like to suggest keeping your resources. One is the binder option. So if you want to go the binder route, you're going to get a whole bunch of binders before the beginning of the school year, and you're going to print out a whole bunch of units that you have for each of the specific domains or each of the specific standards, and go ahead and get those all organized on a beautiful shelf. Now, in the picture, this is, so I have printed off each of the small units for language. So one binder is collective nouns, one binder is irregular plurals, one binder is reflexive pronouns. So it's split up into very small standards, or you can get one of those huge binders like the 3 to 5 inch binders and go ahead and print all of the resources you need. And this will be a growing binder because most of you guys are going to be gathering resources as you teach the resources. But so it'll be a growing binder that you add to throughout the year. There is a star next to this because if you want to push pause, this is a free download for you. I have kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, and they're little free binder covers for each of the 6 domains in Common Core. If you are interested in that, it's very clean and neat for you. There are spine labels as well to help organize all of your resources that you're going to gather throughout the year. Now, they match these binder covers are for if you own any of the ELA resources in my store, but that is free. If you don't want to go the binder route because binders can get expensive, they can take up a lot of room if you have a ton of resources, another option is your file folder option. I love the file folder option because they don't take up as much space. So if you have filing cabinets in your classroom, go ahead and just get a huge box of file folders, and you can either print a beautiful label. I just stuck a Post-it note on the cover of it that says what specific skill that is, and any resource you have for that specific skill, go ahead and put it in your file folder and put it in your filing cabinet. And then when you get to that resource or when you get to that standard, just pull open your file folder, search through each of your, or sorry, I'm getting backwards. Pull open your file folder cabinet and search through all the file folders you have. Pull any file folders that might match that standard. And there you go. You've got your lesson plans, your resources, your passages, anything you might need to teach that skill. Now, we just talked about the behind the scenes binders and resources and organization for the teacher. Now, when you're getting things ready for your students, it's very important for you to kind of give them their resources in an organized fashion. So what I always like to do is at the beginning of each unit, when I'm working on my lesson plans, I paperclip and grab anything that I need for that specific unit, and I put them in a bucket. And throughout that learning unit, that might be 1 week, it might be 2 weeks, you just thumb through that bucket to pull those things you need. You can also do this for the students. So if you have different colored buckets, if you have different colored groups, the red group can go get the red bucket, and that has all the resources they might need for their groups that day. It might have their reading text, it might have their centers or a printable for them. So those are two different things. This is a bucket from Target that I got several years ago, but I know they still have similar buckets at Target. Another thing to get organized before your school year starts is how you're going to write your lesson plans. So if you already have a lesson plan template given to you from your school, go ahead and use that template. If you're looking for a lesson plan template, my ELA units, if you're going to use all of the domains, they do have a similar design, and all the lesson plans are written out for you, so you can just grab those and print them if that's something that your district would allow for you to turn in. Otherwise, you can take them and kind of rewrite them to fit into the lesson plan template that you have for your class. That's definitely something you need to do before the beginning of the year so you can be very cognizant about how your lesson plans need to look and what you need on your lesson plans before you start teaching. So here's another way to, I guess those slides got flip-flopped and I should have had that bucket slide on here. Sorry about that. But we're going back to organizing your materials for the students. So we've talked about lesson plans, binder, resources, materials, and now we're going to talk about how to keep your resources organized for your students. So like I was saying 2 slides ago, it should have been with this slide, but if you're going to color code your groups and have a red group and a blue group and a green group, then have buckets for each of those groups and put all of the resources in Ziploc baggies, in tubs, in folders. Have everything ready so that your transitions and that your directions can be as explicit and as streamlined as possible so the students know exactly what they need to do and they can do it without having to ask you and interrupt your small group time. Now, if you're wanting to teach the students, or if you're wanting the students to work on passages or graphic organizers during small group, it might be easier to have all of that in a folder instead of just having piles of papers around. And go ahead and color code your folders too. If you have green groups and red groups, then have a red folder and a green folder so that the students know to go to one specific place in the room, get that color folder, and whatever is in that is going to be the passage that they're going to read during that group. And some kids might even have the directions so that they're not interrupting. So I always like to have the directions on one side and then whatever the material is on the other side so that they can do that group without having to interrupt you and without having to get too much help from the teacher while she's busy, or he. Another great thing to organize for your classroom is the schedule visual. There's 2 options that I showed on this slide. One is the schedule visual that you would show if you would just do it digitally. Make a little PowerPoint, insert a graph, and you'll have where each of your colored groups are for each round so that the students know, okay, it's round 3, I need to go to read to someone. You could also have it if you don't have a whiteboard a smart board or a projector, or maybe your smart board is one of your groups and you don't want to utilize your whiteboard while you're having your small groups, you can also make like a bulletin board out of it, which is what you see on the right. It just shows where each of your students should be during each group, so that if a student comes in maybe after speech or maybe after intervention, they can look at the schedule board and see where they're supposed to be at that specific time. Now, this tip is more for the teachers group. So at teacher time, you're going to go ahead and what we talked about, use different color folders, different color buckets for each of your students. And that also goes for teacher time. So when you're differentiating your reading groups and your reading passages, go ahead and I like the drawer method, where if you pull out the drawer, you can just pull it out, put it on your table, and everything you need for that day is right in there. So that would probably happen during your lesson planning. So when you're lesson planning, you're going to go ahead and print off all the books that you would need for that week, the passages you would need for that week, put them on binder clips or paper clips, and put them into those groups. Now this I showed probably about 10 or 15 slides ago. It is part of the downloads. It helps you keep up with how you've differentiated each of your small group time. And our final step to our webinar is step 6. We're going to talk about the next steps in getting started. So what actionable steps you can take today or tomorrow to start planning out your ELA block. So the first step, you're going to go ahead and just make a huge, massive to-do list. And we actually did this in our end of the year webinar, and it was very useful. Just get everything that you think you might need to do before planning out your ELA block and get on paper. So what materials you're going to use, figuring out where your kids are going to go, how you're going to group your kids. And there is a checklist on one of the pages that you can download that has a couple things for you already, but if you want to just make it your own and add things to it, go ahead and make that massive to-do list. And then go ahead and start planning out your instruction and your standard instruction. So the star that you see, I have 5 grade levels, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade pacing guides available for Common Core, and they are free. So if you are interested in free pacing guides, I have the link in the description, and it's my suggestions for how I would best teach the 6 domains for each of the 4 quarters. I do have links to resources to use as well. You don't necessarily have to use those resources. If you already have my all-year ELA, this is just how to go ahead and teach those domains within your year. So download those if you need. I'll put the links in the descriptions below. Now, if you are not teaching Common Core, or you you have to follow like a district pacing guide, go ahead and the link will be in the description in just a minute. But these 4 pages are part of the 30-page download you can get at the end. It has long-range plans. They have monthly plans and weekly plans on how to break down your school year. So you can go ahead and plan out as far in advance as you can to see if you can make sure to teach all of the standards within your school year. So this is a full year in the front left picture that you see, and you can kind of plan out which standards and which standards you're going to teach in each month for each of the 6 domains. And this just takes one of the pages that I showed you in the last slide, and you're going to plug it into a monthly plan. Now, if you look at the picture, this is just an example. I've printed off all of my standards that you can see in the back. It's kind of covered right now, but I printed off all the RL standards and RI standards, and you're going to plug them into that long-range plan. So maybe in August, I'll teach RL 2.1 and 2.2, which is ask and answer questions and recounting, I believe. And then RI, I would also teach RI 2.1 and 2.2, which is ask and answer questions and main topic. So that's just an idea of how to plug things in. Write it in pencil, because you're going to have to erase lots and lots throughout the planning time. Then once your school year starts, go ahead and keep a checklist of all your ELA standards that you've taught so that you can be very cognizant about what you need to reteach, what you still need to teach. And this just kind of helps you prevent getting to the month of April and May and realizing that you still have about 6 standards to teach in each of the domains. Also, go ahead and evaluate all of your ELA materials. So this is an action guide that you're getting in the 30-page download, and you're going to start planning your structures, your small groups, how to organize all of it, and then you're going to look at your ELA materials and your ELA resources. You're going to see which kind of resources you need to purchase, which ones you already have, which mentor text you have, and you're going to try to get all of those materials that you need before the school year starts. I know you're going to also continue to buy throughout the school year, or continue to download throughout the school year, or even create, but you want to go ahead and get as much as you can for the first couple months of school so that all of that can be ready for you. Now, the next steps in planning, that final step, which is evaluating your ELA resources, I do already have 5 grade levels of ELA resources already made for you. So if you're interested in that, the next couple slides are going to talk about the resources I have. I have lesson plans for every single standard for every single domain in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. I've got interactive notebook activities, lesson plan activities, printables, graphic organizers, and passages. So there is a star on this page because I have links to all of these all-year bundles in the description below. You can also, if you don't want to go to the link below, I also have on my blog a very quick place for you to just go to. It's one page. You can scroll down. You can grab on this page, you can grab a link for the grade level bundle you want, the grade level pacing guide you want, and the grade level binder covers you want. So if you go to that page, I will drop a link on this page and in the description below. Scroll down, you can grab 2 freebies and the ELA bundle. So we are finished with the webinar. My hopes for you within this webinar were for you to get some ideas on how to organize your block. I wanted to offer you resources to use in your classroom and resources to help you organize your ELA block. And I wanted to help fit all of your content in so that you can teach every single standard that is required of you throughout the school year. So that's it. That's all 6 steps that we covered in the ELA webinar. We talked about throughout the webinar the 30-page download, and now it is time for you to get that download. If you look in the description below, there is a link for your ELA email sign up, or there's a link right here that I'll put on the paper. So in that download is an email sign up. So all you have to do is sign up for my email list. And once you sign up for the email list, you'll get an email confirmation. And in that email confirmation, you will have the big PDF that has all the papers that we talked about throughout the webinar in that download. Also, don't forget, if you're interested in building up your ELA resource library, there is the links for kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade resources for you. So you've got your freebies that you can download, and you've got your ELA resources you could also download if you're interested in that. So all the links are in the description below. I hope that you were able to get as much content out of this webinar as you could. I kept it a little bit over 1 hour. I know this one's a little bit longer than our last one, but there's a lot more content in this one. So good luck with your ELA planning, and if you sign up for my email list, in the next couple days you'll get a email kind of outlining what we just talked about, and then giving you an opportunity to ask any questions that you still may have. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me on my Facebook page, or you can wait to get that email in a couple days and reach out there. So thanks again for watching, and good luck.